Hi everyone, Phil again. Right, bit of a different topic today. I think most of you by now know that I really love flying. It's a great thrill, and the best form of flying that I know of is hang gliding. And when I was 20 in 1975, I took up hang gliding and flew them for 5 years. And why? Why did I do it? Well, have a look at my face in this photo, and then I'll show you a bit of old cine film that gives you a feel for the exhilaration involved. You can probably see from that grainy old cine film footage that it's really quite a thrill to be flying hang gliders. And the reason why is, although I've done lots of flying of lots of different types, I've flown up to 6-seater aeroplanes, I've done quite a lot of gliding, I've flown radar control models. But the thing is with hang gliding, and the reason I loved it was because it's Peter Pan, because that's exactly how it feels. When you get to a certain level in hang gliding, you transition from flying seated to flying lying down, facing downwards in what's called the prone position. And that is fantastic because you feel like Peter Pan. You don't really see any of the glider around you, and your body and your face, your head is looking down, and you look to where you want to go, and off you go, and you go in that direction. And it is pretty much like being in a dream. And no other air sport that I know has quite that same sense of freedom and the feeling of Peter Pan about it. So how did I get into hang gliding? Well, in 1975, before going to university, myself and my brother Chris and a friend of ours, Roger, we clubbed together and we bought a Birdman grasshopper. I'll just show you a photo here now with a very famous old flyer called Ken Messenger. You can see it's a pretty basic machine. So we bought the Birdman grasshopper, and living in the East Midlands, we could only find a tiny hill near Market Harborough. And so we took a brand new car. The only car I've ever had that was brand new was a Hillman Imp, beautiful in red. And here's a photo of the car. And so we found this little hill, and the wind was coming up the hill, and we parked the car at the top of the hill. We rigged the glider up, and of course in those days, this is 75 we're talking about here, hang gliding had only been in Britain for a year or two, and there weren't many hang gliding schools, and certainly none in the sort of flatlands where we lived. And so we were self-taught. So we rigged the glider up and tossed a coin to see who was going to go first, and Roger won or lost the toss, depending upon how you see it, and strapped himself in and stood on the edge of the hill and started to run down the hill. And the hang glider took to the air, which was amazing. I mean, unfortunately we didn't have a camera, because it would have been very funny, because he took to the air and he sailed up above the takeoff point, because we'd underestimated the wind, and he was doing a great job of keeping the hang glider pointing at the wind. Trouble was, he was going backwards, and slowly but surely he ended up going backwards, back behind the takeoff point, and ended up hitting the ground with the tail of the hang glider hitting first, which then catapulted him straight over the top. And the king post on top of the hang glider, which is just like a metal tube with wires connected to it, landed straight onto the roof of the new Hillman Imp and gouged a groove straight down the roof. And Roger and the hang glider collapsed in a heap at the back of the Hillman Imp. And that was the end of Roger's flying career and the end of that hang glider. So that was our very first foray into hang gliding. But then, in 1976, the next year, I went to Swansea University, primarily, in theory, to read geology, which I did just. But in theory, not in theory, in practice, the real reason is because on the prospectus for Swansea University, there was a picture of a hang glider, and there was apparently a very active hang gliding club. And so that's where I wanted to go. Compared to these very cash-strapped days, the universities in those days were very good at encouraging students to do extracurricular activities, and the university at Swansea actually bought us about half a dozen hang gliders for the hang gliding club, which I think at one point reached a membership of about 170 people. And I learnt to fly properly with the hang gliding club there, and then I became one of the instructors, and it was a lot of fun. And we flew all the hills in South Wales, and we used mostly highway products. They produced a glider called a Harrier, which flew very slowly, and that made it safer. And we used that for all the early training. And you can see from these photos, we started training from a very low height, just doing little hops and not always getting them right. And then we went on to slightly bigger hills, and I've got some very early cinefilm footage showing us doing a training session in the winter in the snow in South Wales, learning to fly from slightly bigger hills. When you progressed in training, you then flew from the big hills, and the biggest hill near us that was a very famous hill, still is, it's a very, very beautiful hill, is called Rossilli Down, and it's at the end of the Gower Peninsula where the Worm's Head Peninsula sticks out into the sea, and next to it is a beautiful line of hills which stretch for a couple of miles and just has the smooth winds off the Atlantic blowing straight up and over the Rossilli Down ridge. And that's where all the early hang gliding records in the UK were made in the years that I was flying there. So between sort of 76 and 79, when I was at college, people were setting, for example, the European duration record, flying for about 12 hours up and down the ridge at Rossilli. But it is a magical place and it has a wonderful beach at the bottom of it. And so that's what we used to do. And I used to love flying there, and it had a little hill halfway up called the Pimple that you could land on, and you could take off from the Pimple, and if the wind was right, you could then fly up all the way to the top of the main ridge and then above that. And when you were good enough, you didn't land down at the beach, you landed back on top of the hill. And the thing that I enjoyed more than anything was flying a highway cloud base, flying it two-man, dual. So it was early days of people flying two-man hang gliders, and we basically sat on the equivalent to a child's swing seat, both with a seat belt, and you told your passenger to run like hell as you took off, and off we went, and it was really, really good fun. So I did a lot of flying at Swansea at university, and then I branched out into slightly more advanced stuff. In those days, the goal with hang gliding was to try and fly cross country, to take off from one place and land in another. And it was the very early days of cross country flying. And I remember one day seeing someone take off from a hill a couple of miles away and fly over to the hill that we were flying from and land on top of our hill. And he landed as if he was a god that had flown the whole 2 miles across the valley to our hill. I mean, these days, the world record in Texas back in 2012 is about 475 miles. So things have come on a bit. But a very good friend of mine, Paul Gigg, who he taught me to fly originally at the university. He had what was at the time an advanced glider called a Phoenix, which had long wings, and it was a bit of a handful, and it was high performance, but you had to know what you were doing with it. And I remember one time Paul took his Phoenix glider, and we took 2 or 3 others. We climbed all the way up to the top of Pendine, which is the highest point in South Wales. And Paul prepared to fly from the top of Pendine. The trouble is, Pendine at the top is a cliff, and it had a very gentle breeze blowing up the cliff, but it was pretty much a 90-degree sheer drop off the edge of the cliff. So, plucking up his courage, Paul very carefully went towards the edge of the cliff and put the nose of the glider out over the cliff, and of course the wind immediately caught it. And because the glider wasn't exactly lined up with its wings in the line of the cliff, as soon as one wing went out over the edge of the cliff before the other wing did, the wind got under that wing, and Paul did a 180-degree turn, totally uncontrolled, went out over the cliff, went up into the air, spun round 180 degrees and collapsed in a heap on the top of Pendine, on the flat bit on top. And he only just cleared getting back onto the top. If he'd been a few feet lower, he would have hit the cliff head on and fallen all the way with his glider down to the bottom of the cliff. So he was very lucky to survive that moment. And stupidly, perhaps amazingly, I borrowed his glider once, and I had to do a geology field trip one summer in Dolgelly in North Wales, and I found a hill called Talybont near Harlech Castle, and I used his glider to fly for about, well, I took off and I got into turbulence that I'd never come across before, and this glider was a handful anyway. And I got thrown all around the sky, and all I wanted to do was get back on the ground. And I wrestled with this thing for sort of 10-15 minutes before I could safely get it back on the ground. And I gave the glider back to Paul and thanked him profusely for a loan of his lovely machine, and I never went near it again. But that's what hang gliding was like in those days. And yeah, things did happen, you know. Like sailing, like the sea, the air is very unforgiving, and you have to be very careful. And because we're all self-taught, a lot of people learnt, unfortunately, fatal lessons. One of our club members, I remember flying with him one day, and he took to the air in what was a pretty much experimental machine at the time called a Griffin. Which was a weird looking machine with a sort of extra bit on the nose, a sort of spout on the nose. And he took off and was flying near a cliff, and he was doing a 360-degree turn round. And as he did most of the turn, he accidentally stalled the glider and it fell in a spiral, and he missed the cliff edge by, well, I'd like to say inches, but it must have been feet, but not many. And he lived to tell the tale. But you know, we all learned from each other and from seeing what happens in different conditions. And these days, hang gliding is much, much safer, and it's an established sport in its own right. So there we go. One of the happiest and most fun occasions I had hang gliding while I was at university was with my good friend Alex, that I think some of you have met before in earlier videos. And we decided to go to his home village called Pendine in South Wales, which is a very famous place, partly because Dylan Thomas was from near there, but also because of the fabulous, I think it's 7-mile long beach that runs all the way along with sand dunes next to it. And at the end of the beach, end of the 7 miles, is a cliff that runs at 90 degrees to the line of the beach. And next to that cliff is a slipway where people go down onto the beach, and next to the slipway is a pub. So anyhow, Alex and I took a couple of the university hang gliders, and the wind was blowing beautifully onto the cliffs, which were about 200 or 300 feet high. So we climbed up to the top of the hills there, and we took off and we flew. We had a great time, and we were soaring up and down those cliffs for an hour or two. And while we were doing so, there was a land speed record attempt being taking part on the beach. Which is not unusual for Pendine Sands, because that's our equivalent of the Bonneville salt flats in America, and it's where all the early British land speed records were set, with Babs and cars like that. Anyway, there was a guy called Barry Bowles, who was known as the Blonde Bombshell, who had put together on a minimal budget a rocket car. And so he was trying to break the British rocket car speed record on Pendine Sands. So whilst we were flying above him and all his entourage and the crew and all the gear, they were setting this car up. And then from the sky, we watched him fly, have his attempt. And he hurtled off down the beach, and I think he got to about nearly 200 miles an hour. And the sand, I think, was soft in places, and he totally lost control, and the car flipped over and somersaulted several times down the beach. And there is still some some video footage, film footage on YouTube that you can see, and that footage featured very often on BBC's news programs in those days. This was about 1978. So Barry Bowles luckily was not killed, and his machine was completely smashed to bits. But he crawled out the wreckage, and he went off to the pub to lick his wounds. By then, we'd finished our hang gliding session and we'd enjoyed watching the entertainment on the beach. And so we came down and landed. And of course, the place to land for us was next to the pub car park by the slipway. So that's what we did. We came in and we landed by the slipway. And the irony was that to cap it all, at the end of that great day for us, Barry Bowles, pint in hand, still sort of shaking, wanders over the pub car park to us with our hang gliders. And he said to us, "You guys, you're absolutely nuts. You're going to kill yourselves with those things." So after university, the real world beckoned, and I took a graduate trainee, marketing trainee course in Dunlop, selling tyres to Africa and the Far East, and then joined the family company. But I didn't give up on my flying. I then went and I got my glider pilot's license. And then I got into powered flying. I had an early flying scholarship for a few hours training when I was young, back in the 70s. But in about 86, I then went out to America and got my pilot's license out there and completed the license. And I've been flying powered aeroplanes ever since then. But I always had a hankering to go back to the hang gliding days, because they were perhaps some of the happiest moments of my life, was during those 3 years at Swansea University. And so occasionally, for example, I remember one weekend we went with friends to a place called Mam Tor up in the Peak District, where they were flying hang gliders and paragliders. And I remember watching them flying very enviously and wishing that I could still do that. So in about 2010, when paragliding had come in to take over from hang gliding, because paragliding is in some ways more convenient. The trouble with a hang glider is when you pack it up, it's still 20 foot long, it's quite heavy, and you have to carry it on your shoulders to the flying site from the nearest road. So it's not as convenient as a paraglider that sort of fits in a rucksack and you can take up alpine chairlifts and places like that. So I thought, well, I'd better have a go at this paragliding business. So I went with Alex to Tenerife, and I did a week's hang gliding course, and you can see some photos that I'll show you here. And at the end of the week, I had one big flight from sort of foothills of Mount Teide down to the beach down on the coast there. But I never really bonded with paragliding after hang gliding, because to me, in a hang glider, flying prone, you were like Peter Pan, as I said earlier, and with a hang glider, you have control in all directions, so you can very easily control the pitch and the turning, the rolling and yawing of the hang glider. Whereas I always felt a little bit with paragliding that you have the parachute up here and the pilot is down here, and you're hanging like a sack of spuds. And whilst you can turn and fly without too much trouble, you don't have quite the same feeling in the pitch, in the up and down plane. And I didn't like the fact that I sort of didn't see anything other than these wires going up past me. So I never quite bonded for some reason with paragliding, but I gave it a go. In 2013, whilst I was in France, I decided to have another go at hang gliding just to remember what it was like. So I went to a place near the Millau Bridge down in the sort of south west of France, and I can show you some photos and some videos to show you how I got on, and it was like going back to being a beginner again, learning with little training hops, and then eventually I did a big flight from the top of the nearby well, big hill, small mountain, down to the fields at the bottom, and it was great and I really enjoyed it.
Run, 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 run. Run, 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 run. Still running, still running. Au revoir. Au revoir. Bon vol.
Au revoir.
Tranquille. Dis qu'il relâche. Non, 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 non. Bon, on va passer la barre. On va pas que ça bouge. Allez, gars. Je pense qu'il a déjà volé. Allez à droite. Right.
Right, right, on your right.
Ah, mais super. Tranquille. Maintenant, il fait une ligne droite vers la terre.
Very nice. Go straight on landing package. Right, and then straight on.
Keep speed. Keep speed.
So there we are. So then we come to today, and the week before lockdown, on the 16th of March, I was due to go to Canada and then to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to the sand dunes there, which is where the Wright brothers learnt to fly, and it's now the home of one of the biggest hang gliding schools in the world. And I had booked in to do a week's hang gliding course and to fly a replica of the 1902 Wright's glider. And of course, COVID has come along, and that's the end of that. But I still intend to go back there and to do some more hang gliding when it makes sense to go back out there. So yeah, that's what I'm waiting to do, and I can't wait to go out there. So finally, I just thought you'd be interested. If we go all the way back to 1979, when I was leaving Swansea University, I had the biggest decision in my life to make, really. And that was whether to stay in this country and follow conventional career path, which I did with Dunlop and then the family commercial property business, or to follow the passion that I had at the time, which was hang gliding. And I wrote to all the manufacturers of hang gliders in America, famous names like Delta, Up hang gliders, Sunbird, all these different people. And they all very kindly wrote back to me, and I remember I had some lovely letters from them, all offering me employment if I could get a work permit out there. And one of the guys that wrote back was a guy called Bill Bennett, who was one of the most famous hang glider pilots in the world, who went on to fly as James Bond in You Only Live Twice, where I think he flies a hang glider over a waterfall. And I sometimes wonder how my life would have evolved had I have spent from 1979 over in probably California, in the hang gliding world. I shall never know, but it always is there at the back of my mind, wondering how it might have been. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this look at hang gliding. It was fantastic for me, and I'll always remember it. But yeah, keep watching Phil's Fun for Fogies videos. I've got 1 or 2 more in the pipeline, and I'm trying to hit that 1,000 hits mark. So please keep hitting the like button and subscribe and tell all your friends. And I think I'm at about 850 or so at the moment. So let's see if we can't get to 1,000 hits, and that will be great. Okay, stay safe. All the best. Bye.